Hey guys, I'm excited to share this video with you. We're going to walk through step by step on how to tool this little card wallet. Now the pattern for this is being given away as a bonus pattern if you get in on our pattern book volume 3 in the first 3 days. So it's a 3-day for volume 3 bonus that we're doing with this pattern here, but later on we may offer this as a pattern pack. If so, we'll put that link in the description. But for right now, there's a link in there if you want to find out exactly when this pattern book is available and be notified. Be sure to sign up with the link in the description there. But let's head over and get started on this. The leather that we're using on this is about a 6 ounce, kind of a 6-7 ounce, but the lighter end of that, of Herman Oak veg tan leather. We're gonna wet that down with some water here, get that moisture content right in there, kind of a quick casing of our leather. You can see that water starting to absorb in there. And as that absorbs in there, we're gonna get ready to trace this pattern off. Now, I've already cut my pattern out here, and this is taped front and back with a clear packing tape. So I'm going to go ahead and put this down on here, and we'll start transferring the pattern with my stylus. I want to go over my lines, making sure I hold everything in place, just pushing down on there. All right, now you'll notice I did not transfer that border line. I'm going to come back with a set of dividers to get that line. So we have that set in at 1/4 of an inch for a border there. And if you don't have a set of dividers, you can simply use a straight edge and your stylus to do the same thing. Now the first thing I'm going to do is come back and cut in those borders that I just laid in there. Now you'll see in the corners here I haven't connected those cuts. Anywhere there's a point, I'm not going to connect those just for durability of your pattern. We'll actually connect that when we bevel. So now we're going to come along here and get the rest of our cuts pulled in. A few things about these cuts as we're going. See, there's some long sweeping cuts in this pattern, so I'm positioning myself to be able to pull those nice and smooth all the way through here. I start lightening my pressure up as we're pulling those cuts to be able to fade my lines. Again, we're not connecting any of these cuts, and leaving that open so we can connect them with my bevel. All right, now this is a really tight little curve here, so watch this. We're going to start here. I'm turning my knife and turning that leather. Get to a point where I'm stopped here. Turn that project around. I'm going to come back in that cut just a little bit just to start getting that line. I'm not pushing down and cutting yet until I get to the end of the line, but I have that curvature down now, so that's going to keep that nice smooth cut. Sometimes that can be tricky, getting those tight circles or those long sweeping cuts and keeping those smooth. Part of that is just really looking ahead and planning out where you're going to be able to move your leather and your hand as you go. Getting down just a few more cuts here. Here's another one. We're going to start this cut around. I'm moving that leather at the same time. You see I was able to roll that all the way around there. Another really tight one here on the inside. Start by pulling that around here. Rotate that. Come back in my cut. Start following that around just to keep the curvature of that. Lighten up pressure and fade that cut out. So all these that I'm talking about fading, they're the ones that are ending within that vine work. So we don't want to just stop them abruptly. We're going to fade those cuts out And you can see if this vine is growing this way, it's growing that way, I'm pulling cuts backwards down to where it's growing out of and fading those cuts out. This bevel that I'm using, this particular one is a Berry King. That's a number 2 checkered bevel. I'm going to start by beveling all of our borders in so that shadow is going in towards our vine work. Now we have that border beveled in. Time to start going around this vine work here. Now, notice as I'm moving that bevel along, I'm keeping consistent pressure down with my mallet and walking that bevel very slow. And that's going to be the key to getting those smooth bevel lines. Now, as we come in here to any border that's overlapping, and if it's squishing out there, it's real easy to come back and just touch that up. Make sure we have a smooth transition of our lines. Again, as I move along here, I'm moving that bevel very little to the side each time that I'm hitting down. And that's what's keeping that line moving around there smooth, where I only have to bevel that the one time. I'm not having to go back and touch that up very much. Now, if you have some choppy spots in your beveling, you can go back and go over them a couple times to try to even that up. But the idea is, as you're practicing, work towards getting those lines smooth the first time, so you're saving time and not having to go back and re-bevel those as much. Now we're wanting to watch our moisture content in there, make sure our leather's not getting too dry or we're not tooling on it too wet. A few of the ways that we can tell that is, one, if I'm having to hit it very hard to get this nice dark burnish, that burnish is that dark color that we're getting in there. If I'm having to really hit my tool hard to get that, or even hit my tool, it's not getting that color at all, we're probably too dry. If my lines are getting to where it's getting harder and harder to get smooth lines, if they're starting to get choppier and choppier, yet you feel like you're doing the right things and not moving that tool too far, chances are you may be getting just a touch dry on there. Now, if you're beveling too wet, your line's going to be wanting to shove in, and you'll see your cut line in there. If you're starting to really see a lot of your actual cut line, then the likelihood is that you're beveling too wet. Also, if it's too wet, it can feel very mushy, and you'll get a little bit of drag as well. That tool can kind of stick in your leather a little bit if it's too wet. Experience is just going to kind of help you with that over time. The more you tool, you'll start getting the feel of it, and you'll try putting a little bit more water on there or a little less, and start to feel that difference. It's one of the hardest things to explain on video is how wet you need your leather. It's a lot easier when you're in person to be able to tell someone, no, that's a little too dry or that's a little too wet. And then they start getting the feel of it. But those are a few of the signs that can kind of get you headed in the right direction anyhow. The other thing that's helping with these smooth lines too, even on this small project that wants to move around, you can see I'm anchoring my fingers down here and holding that leather in place. And then I'm pulling that hand to me a little bit. Those anchor fingers are there, drawing that back. If we get too far, then we can reposition your fingers. Now the inside of these curves, there's these two big swirls in this pattern. You notice I haven't really beveled in there yet. Now if this is the only bevel you have, we can get in there and tip that bevel. By tipping that, I'm making that a smaller space that's actually in the leather, so we can get around there without chewing up our leather. Your two other options are to switch to a smaller bevel. Just a narrower bevel is going to fit around there a lot better. Or I really like this round bevel. It's a round face checkered bevel, so it's not flat on that side. That really fits in there and adds to that depth that we can get. We'll come back in a minute and use this bevel again to get some more depth from there. All right, now that our beveling's done, it's time to move on to some shading. And for shading today, I'm going to use this vertical line thumbprint. It's my go-to tool for shading. We're gonna see I'm always tipping that tool. I never want to leave that flat and get a full tool impression. I'm kind of tipping and rolling that tool depending on where I want that shading at. Now, that's the other big question I get is, well, where do I want my shading at? I don't know where to shade at. And that's where the value of being able to see a pattern that's already tooled and start learning that, being able to look at that and kind of trying to emulate will help a lot. But a little bit of a rule of thumb is you can see a vine like this, it has kind of a concave line here versus a couple little rounded lines there. On the rounded side is where I'm going to put more of that darker shadowing in there. So when I shade, it's not like, for this style of tooling, I'm not putting shading on there necessarily like the light's coming from one side and everything's shaded the other way. It's not really so much like that. It's more kind of just some fundamental things like following those rounded curves. It's going to help lend to the overall appeal to it. You know, there's other styles that are more of a very realistic type of look to them that are going to follow some different guidelines, but that is not what we're talking about here today. So this style here is going to be more of a, kind of have a Sheridan foundation to it. But now with that shader, I'm also going to roll down on the inside of these little swirls here. I'm going to try to get some shading and depth in there, because that's actually the back side of that as it's rolling around, right? Do that over on this one here as well. Now then, on these swirls here, this one I'm going to change the rule just a little bit. Where we did our shading on the rounded side of some of these, I'm going to come on the inside of these. You can see they look distinctly different than the rest of your vines, right? So I'm going to come in here tip and just real lightly put a little bit of shading in here. And that's just going to help add a little bit of depth. We're going to come back with another tool here in a minute to the outside of those, but it's just a very subtle thing. And another thing, you can almost take that tool just in your hands because it is so light here, and just use your hands with that tool without using your mallet. That might give you a little bit more control, rolling that around there. Come back and just soften that inside line a little bit there. So there we get just a little bit of shading on the insides there. All right, I'm going to set that tool back up there. Now, right in here, I'm going to add a little detail. We're going to kind of run through these detail tools here. I'm just going to use my stylus right here as almost as a stop. Now, there's a few other tools that you can use in that place, but if you already have your stylus there, I just want to show you that one there. That works really well. Right behind that little crease, I'm going to come with a mule's foot. Kind of looks like a little V in here. I'm going to fade a few of those right in behind that stop there. Now switching over to a veiner. So this is a small scalloped line veiner here. And on these swirls, oops, don't throw your tools around, it's bad for them. On these swirls here, I'm going to look at the curve of that swirl. It's going to match the curve of that tool. But I'm going to tip this up, angled it, watching for the impression that's coming off of here. And I'm starting this really light and fading it in. But my guideline is kind of the center of this swirl is where that impression is going to be pointing to. So you can see as I move around here, I'm rotating that tool. We're fading into it, starting to hit a little bit harder as we get around kind of the apex of this curve here. And then we're going to fade that back out. So that just adds a bit of texture to the outside. And we're going to come, I know there's still some open space in here, but that's okay. We're going to come back and utilize that in a minute here as well. Sometimes it can be easy to go too much. You know, sometimes that less is more. Some of these tools, if we go too much, you take away almost the negative space, which then you can't get the depth, you know, with our shading and some of these veiners and things like that. If you get too aggressive with them and start doing too much, now you've shaded down or put too much texture on the whole thing, then you've lost that ability to get your depth in there. So remember sometimes that less is more. And I said we were going to come back to that rounded beveler. I really like this little tool. I'm going to use this kind of in place of another tool called a lifter. I'm going to come in on the inside of these swirls here and really add a little ridge to that. Fade that off on the inside. But see the depth that just added between this one and that one? So I'm going to come over here and hit this one as well, doing the same thing. Fade into that. Get down in there. I'm going to fade out of it right here as this fades. Okay. One more spot in this pattern, and I'm going to use that tool. It's right on this little vine that shoots off of the one swirl here. Kind of have a little curve in there. See, that just kind of picks that up, adds a little bit to it, right? Right The next tool I'm going to go to is we're going to look at our backgrounds now. So this is a bar grounder and has little seeds in it that line up. I'm going to rotate this tool around so it kind of fans out, fills that area of those background spaces. I don't want to turn it in different directions within that space to fill those. I want to just simply rotate that tool as I can. Now there's a lot of different background tools out there. This is just one option. You can use a matte backgrounder, which is a lot more forgiving of a tool, I think, in those backgrounds. You can turn it a lot more different directions, and it's going to still look pretty decent even with overlapping in different directions. So you can see there, as I had more space to fill, I simply moved that tool up and kind of overlapped some of those seeds. Now I can fan that out into that point there. So I'm going to put that background tool away and go ahead and get my swivel knife back out. Yeah, now we're time to go ahead and put those decorative cuts in there. So starting with what I'll call these little sticker vines down here, I'm just going to start a couple cuts, starting them deep, having some curve, fading them off there. But I'm running them not parallel. They're not two cuts running together. They're closer at the point and they're fading out, and they're different lengths. That's going to start helping bring flow to that pattern and depth to it as well. So I'm running a short cut and a long cut down there. It doesn't have to be. Maybe you run a long cut and then a short cut. This is where you really get to play with it and start bringing in some of your own style to it. I mean, I can even add a few extra cuts on the end of that, and it's going to work. There's no really one right way to do this. And there's just some fundamentals that we follow. Start pulling back towards the main base of where that vine's coming. So really think about these cuts and what you're wanting them to do. So we're not just putting them in there just to put them in there because somebody said you needed decorative cuts, but we're trying to add flow. Bring, you know, if this is coming off of here, we're wanting it to kind of swoop and fall down in there. And we add a whole lot more to those patterns when we run those cuts in there. Now these swirls, I've been kind of liking starting up here at these points. I want a few cuts off there. Now watch this one big one. If we can pull that nice smooth cut, it's going to help really add to that flow around there. I really hesitate here because less is more sometimes, right? I don't want to overdo it, but just gonna throw a couple little cuts here, make this look a little bit different as well. Add those little points in there. Just give it a little something different. Again, not something you have to do, but just figured we'd try that on this one, see how it looked, and kind of happy with it.